Hi guys, Shay here. I'm coming at you this week with a little bit of a different episode. I recently did a live History Fix show just a few days ago. It was super awesome. That was organized through the libraries here in Dare County, the Dare County Libraries, as a way to kick off their sustainer program that they've started to try to help raise funds for the libraries here in Dare County. I'll post a link with more information about that in the description if you're a Dare County resident or just have a particular interest in Dare County libraries. Feel free to check that out. I do want to say, because this was a live show and I have zero skill in recording large rooms or any sort of gear to do so, the sound quality of this episode is going to be a little bit different than a normal episode, just kind of the nature of a live show. But I really hope you enjoy it anyway. It was an awesome experience. And this story that I have for you today is incredible. So without further ado, here is the first ever live History Fix show.
I have the great pleasure of introducing Shay LaFountaine. We started talking back in October about a way that Shay could inform us about some cool history about the written word. I have been a longtime listener of her podcast, and I know if you're in this room, you're very interested, and I'm so happy to see so many people here. Shay is a former elementary school teacher, a patron of KDH Library, and a mom of 2 little boys, and we're so happy to have you here.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us today. Without further ado.
I just want to start by saying thank you for being here. It is very cold outside, and I know a lot of people are sick right now, so the fact that you made it to this room is pretty amazing. We'll go ahead and get started. I'd start by telling you my name, but you already know it. These symbols on the screen behind me actually tell you my name. Each of these symbols represents a sound that we can make with our mouths, our tongues, our larynx, and when you make each of those sounds, you say my name, which is Shay LaFountaine. Kind of. It's actually not spelled very phonetically, but it's kind of. So I'm really here today to tell you the story of how Shay LaFountaine became these 12 symbols. And that is the story of writing and the story of how writing changed the world. We don't really think about it. You know, you probably sat down and just kind of like read that and thought, oh, her name must be Shay LaFountaine. And you didn't really think about it, but that's sort of us taking for granted this technology that took really millennia to develop. There's a lot that most people probably don't know about writing. Like, you probably don't know that it seems to have been invented independently 3 separate times in 3 separate places throughout human history. Pretty crazy. It's shaped empires, it's begat religions, and really, if you think about it, nothing about this world and this society that we live in would be the same without writing. So let's fix that. That's what we're going to be talking about today. A quick introduction. As I said, my name is Shay LaFountaine. I am the host of History Fix podcast, which comes out every Sunday. You can listen to it wherever you get podcasts. It's free. Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, my website. You can find it there. Little background in case you don't know. I was born and raised in Kill Devil Hills. And as Hannah said, I taught elementary school. I taught 4th grade at First Flight Elementary School for about 8 years. And then in 2021, left the classroom to take care of 2 small children and to pursue a career in curriculum development. And then I started a podcast in all of my free time, which is sarcasm. But, leaving the classroom, I felt like there was, I'm very much an educator. And so I felt like there was a little bit of something missing there where I wanted an opportunity to kind of continue to educate more directly. And so a podcast seemed like a good way to do that. And when I thought about what do I need to be teaching about? What do I need to be educating or informing people? History seemed to me like a great area of need because a lot of people don't know history. And there's really 2 reasons for that. One is that a lot of people aren't interested in history. They don't care to learn it because they think it's really boring, right? And unfortunately, this is kind of how it's taught in schools a lot of time. If you think back to your high school history class, it's pretty boring. It's just like memorizing dates and, portraits of old men in powdered wigs and that sort of thing. And so I think a lot of people think history is boring. And to me, it's super, super interesting. It's just true stories, about these remarkable feats and incredible people. And so I really want to tell it that way. And I want to get people interested in history so that they'll want to learn it. But the other reason why people don't know history is because a lot of our history is wrong. There's a lot of misconceptions, and there's a lot of just straight up mistakes in what we've been taught. And the reason for that is because, tonight we're talking about the history of writing. The history of writing is really the history of history. If it didn't get written down, we don't know about it. So you have to look at, well, who was writing things down? And that, for most of time, was men. It was almost entirely men, as you will see. And in the West, at least, it was mostly white men. And so what we have is this minority, really, this small group recording all of the history. And so what that means is that, for the most part, the histories of women and the histories of other marginalized groups, people of color, indigenous peoples, did not get written down, or it got written down incorrectly because it was written by someone who didn't really know the full story. So the mission of History Fix is, there's really two. I want to give people their story, I want to give people their fix, but I also want to actually literally fix or correct these misconceptions and these holes in the narrative, and sort of set the record straight. So the record that I want to set straight for you today is the history of writing. And this one, I knew it was going to be a lot going into it, but the history of writing is just like the history of the whole world. So get ready. We know that, or we believe at least, that writing, this technology of writing, was invented 3 separate times, which I think is really crazy that 3 independent groups of humans came up with this concept. The earliest writing, or really proto-writing, goes back to 10,000 years ago in ancient Mesopotamia, Fertile Crescent, Tigris, Euphrates. But then about 8,000 or 9,000 years ago, we also have a form of early writing in China. And most scholars believe that this was developed separately. I mean, geographically, I think it's possible. There's some sharing of ideas, but the theory is it was developed separately. And then about 3,000 years ago, we have writing in Mesoamerica, in what is now Mexico, Central America. And that we know was developed separately because they had no contact with these other people. So unfortunately, we don't know a whole lot about the writing in Mesoamerica and China, the early writing, but we do know a lot about the writing in Mesopotamia, which is where our writing comes from. Now, when it started 10,000 years ago, it did not look like this. It did not look like these 26 letters where each letter stands for a different sound that we can make, and when you kind of blend them all together, you're saying things, right? It didn't look like this. It actually looked like this. So we call these tokens, and they were usually made out of clay, and they were all different shapes, cone shapes, spheres, some were oval shapes, cylinder shapes. And these were actually used for accounting in ancient Mesopotamia. So they were used for keeping track of trade goods, how many, for example, the cone shape represented a large quantity of grain. The spheres were a small quantity of grain. An oval shape represented a jar of oil. And so they were used for keeping track of how many jars of oil somebody owned, or how many jars of oil somebody owed you for, that sort of thing. A couple of things we know about these. They were used all over the Middle East, so in areas that spoke different languages. So we know that they weren't based on phonetics, because these words for grain and oils were different. So it's not like the word cone sounded like the word grain, and that's why they used a cone, because they're all using the cone for grain, and they have different words for grain. We also know that to show plurality, to show more than one, you just needed more than one of that token. So if you have 3 jars of oil, you need 3 oval-shaped tokens. So this is how it started. Doesn't really look much like writing at all. But eventually, they started keeping these tokens in what archaeologists call envelopes. They don't really look like envelopes. It's kind of this clay ball jar thing. And so this would be a way to keep track of a debt. If someone owes you for 3 jars of oil, you would put 3 oval-shaped tokens in this envelope. And then eventually they figured out, this is kind of a pain. If I want to figure out how much this guy owes me, I have to bust open this thing and get these tokens out, and this is a whole thing. So what they started doing is they started pressing the tokens into the front of the envelope when the clay was still wet. And you can see, oh, that works nice. You can see the markings that they made there. So now, if this is up on high shelf, you can just look at the front and you can see what's in there. They basically were writing it on the front of the envelope. And this is super significant because this is the first time that we have 3-dimensional object turning into a 2-dimensional symbol that represents that object. So this is really, in a way, the earliest form of writing. Now, eventually they realized, like, you know, hey, if it says on the front of the envelope what's in the envelope, we don't even need to put the tokens in the envelope anymore. It's on the front, right? They don't even need to be in there. And so they started using flat clay tablets instead of these round jars. You know, they're flat, they lay flat, they take up less space. And they started pressing the tokens into the tablet to keep these records. So this particular tablet shows 3 large measures of grain, the 3 kind of wedge shapes made by the cones, and 2 small measures of grain. That's what this says. And then that evolved even further to using a reed stylus, kind of like this. So using that kind of like a pencil, now they can carve whatever kind of symbol they want into the clay, right? It's not limited to what you can make with these tokens. And so this tablet, which was found in Iran, you can see here where they've drawn this kind of shape. This is supposed to represent a jar of oil. And you'll also notice the shapes made by the tokens, but they've actually repurposed them here. So here they're representing numbers. I know they look a lot like they're the same shapes as the measures of grain, but here they've repurposed them, and the circles represent tens, and the wedge cone shapes represent ones. So this is showing 33 jars of oil. So now we've got a way to show an amount, right? You don't have to draw 33 of those symbols. Now we've got this number with it, which is really cool. But then another need arises because they need a way of recording names, right? Like who owns 33 jars of oil? Like that kind of matters in accounting. They need a way to record names. But it's not like, you know, they're not going to like draw a portrait of the person's face. Like no one's going to be able to tell who that is. So what they do is they draw something that sounds like that person's name. So for example, here's just like some modern examples. If your name is Jack, you might draw a jack like you would use to play the game jacks. If your name's Neil, you might draw someone kneeling. If your name's Shay, you may draw like shade, a number, something that gives shade, like something that sounds like it. So the need to write names, to record names, is really the first time we see symbols that represent sounds, like phonetic, instead of just representing an object or looking like a jar of oil. So we have the sounds coming into play now. So this evolved more and more over thousands of years into what's really considered the first ever official writing, which is Sumerian cuneiform, which you can see here. And they would use those reed styluses to kind of wedge out these symbols. And some of the symbols were based on objects, and some of the symbols were based on sounds. It's kind of a mix between like a phonetic and like a object symbolism here. But this Sumerian cuneiform really spread throughout the ancient world. So our first real little story today is the story of someone of note who used Sumerian cuneiform. And for that, we have to go to the ancient city of Nineveh. And actually, this was my most recent episode. If you listen to the most recent episode, has anyone ever heard of Nineveh before? So Nineveh might sound familiar because it's in the Bible. It's mentioned in the Bible actually 19 times. And if you're trying to place it, it comes from the story of Jonah in the Bible. It's actually where God is trying to send Jonah to deliver this message, and he doesn't want to go, and he ends up getting eaten by the big fish. That's Nineveh. And in the Bible, it's kind of like this scary place. Like there are these like brutal tyrants. That's why Jonah doesn't want to go, because they're like these brutal tyrants in Nineveh. But the thing is, for a long time, there was no proof that Nineveh actually existed outside of the Bible, right? It was just, that was the only mention of it was in the Bible. So there were people who wondered, was this a real actual place, or is this just a fictional setting in a story? And they didn't know. Kind of like Troy, same thing. Troy from the Iliad and the Odyssey, the Trojan War. People didn't know if Troy was a real place or if it was just a fictional setting. Turns out Troy was real, and so was Nineveh. It was actually discovered in the mid-1800s. And when they discovered it, they found a library. The first ever library. The guy who discovered it, he described it as he found these chambers in the palace, and the floor of the chambers was just covered over a foot high, piled with these tablets, and a lot of them were broken and smashed, but we've managed to piece them back together, and we've actually learned a lot about Nineveh and about this world from these tablets. And this is called the Library of Ashurbanipal. So Let me tell you a little bit about Ashurbanipal. He was this fascinating guy. I really didn't know that much about him until I started digging into this. He was one of the last kings of Assyria. And Assyria at this time, 650 BC, was the largest empire on earth. And he was the king of that empire with the capital of Nineveh. He was based in the capital of Nineveh. And he's this really interesting character to me, and I love this relief carving. He's this really interesting character because he's very dynamic. Like he's this brutal conqueror. He's expanding the empire. He's taken over the world. He's defeating all his enemies. He defeats his own brother. He's hunting lions. But at the same time, he's like this huge bookworm, tablet worm, if you will. He's very literate. He loves to read and write, which is super rare actually at the time. Kings did not tend to be literate. They had scribes for that. So he's what's known as a scribal king, which is very rare for this time to be a king and be able to read and write. And I love this relief carving because it shows him in the act of killing a lion. But if you look closely, you can actually see a stylus used for writing tucked into his sort of like belt or sash around his waist. So it's like kind of showing the two sides of this guy, which I think is really fascinating. But he was very much a believer in the notion that knowledge is power, right? He's not just like reading and writing because it's like fun. He's reading and writing because he thinks that by learning as much as he possibly can, it's making him more powerful. And so he starts to collect these tablets from all over the ancient world, and he starts to collect them in his library. And he's using it kind of as an artificial memory, right? Because the more he can know, the more powerful he can be. He wants to be the most powerful human on earth. And so that is why he created his library, was to sort of build this power from all of this knowledge that he held there. We don't really know what happened to Ashurbanipal. It's like kind of a mystery, but we do know that soon after his death, the Assyrian Empire collapsed. Nineveh fell, sort of destroyed from within, honestly. And the remains of that library were buried under his palace for 2,000 years until they were rediscovered in the 1800s. Which just like gives me chills. But when we found it, like I said, we learned a lot about that world that we did not know. One really significant find that came out of that library is the Epic of Gilgamesh, which is considered to be the first ever work of literature. It's basically a collection of poems from all over the ancient world that, it's an epic, so it's really the precursor to the Iliad and the Odyssey, all of these sort of quest adventure stories. And this particular image is of the flood tablet, which tells the story of a great flood, which is very likely the same great flood mentioned in the Bible, but from a different perspective, which is like really, really cool to me. But let's go back actually well before Ashurbanipal. Remember I said Sumerian cuneiform, this concept of writing, was spreading all over the ancient world, and one place that it made its way to was Egypt. The Egyptians loved writing. They wrote everything down, which is awesome for us now. They recorded a lot of things, but the concept was the same, drawing some symbols that represented objects, some symbols that represented sounds, but the symbols were totally different because the Egyptians spoke a different language, right? So just kind of like, for example here, if you were going to write the word flea, like the insect, like the annoying insect that bites you, that's going to look the same in Sumerian and in Egyptian, because fleas look the same in both places, right? But if you were going to write the word flee, like to run away, to like flee from something, that word sounds different in both languages, so they're not both going to draw this symbol. So because of that, we have like a totally different set of symbols in Egyptian than we do in Sumerian. But neither language was very efficient. So Sumerian cuneiform, it evolved down to about 400 symbols, and then Egyptian hieroglyphics had over 1,000. There didn't actually seem to be any limit. They just kind of like drew whatever they wanted. So not very efficient. Would hate to have to teach this to a kindergartner. So eventually, other cultures kind of latched on the idea, and they were like, well, we can make this better, right? So let's go to 1500 BC. We have in Lebanon, modern day Lebanon, we have a people living there called the Canaanites. They're also in the Bible. You may have heard of them. And they spoke a language called Phoenician. And they developed the Phoenician alphabet, which is really like the first alphabet that's kind of similar to what we use today. So the way that they did this is they would draw something. They would draw a symbol that started with the same sound as that letter. Okay, so for example, in Phoenician, the word for house was bet. So they drew a house, it's supposed to be a house, they drew a house to represent the B sound. That was their letter B. The word for fence was het, right? It starts with a sound. So for the letter H, they drew a fence. Kind of looks like our letter H. The word for palm of hand was calf. So they drew it looks to me like the lines in the palm of your hand to represent the K sound. Looks a lot like our letter K too. So I thought that was interesting. That's kind of where our letter K came from the lines in the palm of your hand. Never knew that. The word for water was mem. So they drew kind of like a wavy water shape to represent the M sound. So like in an English equivalent, this would be like drawing an apple for the letter A, right? Drawing like a bumblebee for B, a cat for C. That's basically what they're doing. And this is the Phoenician alphabet. You'll probably notice a lot of similarities. I mean, Z is just like a straight up Z. Like that hasn't changed at all. And N, M, L, K, a lot of these are really similar. But this has a long way to go before it turns into our alphabet. But this concept, now there's only 22 letters. They didn't have any vowel sounds. It's only consonant sounds. But this concept spreads throughout the ancient world, and other languages start creating their own versions. The symbols are different because the words for things are different, but other languages start creating their own versions. Hebrew, there's a Hebrew alphabet that comes about, Aramaic, and then our next story deals with someone who used the Hebrew and the Aramaic alphabets, and that is Ezra. Ezra lived about 450 BC. He was a Jewish priest and scribe who he was exiled with other Jewish people in Babylon and kicked out of their homeland of Jerusalem. But during Ezra's lifetime, the Jews were actually able to return to Jerusalem. And Ezra was one of the guys who sort of led the Jews back into Jerusalem. But when they got there, he's kind of horrified to find, Jerusalem's sort of in ruins and the people are no longer following the Jewish religion. Too much time has passed. They've kind of forgotten where they've come from. So he busts out these scrolls that are all written in Hebrew, and he's like, look, you gotta remember the scriptures, remember we're supposed to be doing all this. And they're like, we don't understand Hebrew. Like, we speak Arabic, we don't understand Hebrew. So Ezra rewrites the Hebrew scriptures in Aramaic script so that people can understand it. And he kind of revives the Jewish religion, which at that time otherwise may have just kind of fizzled out. So he's able to sort of translate it into this other script that the people can understand. And then we have the ancient Greeks. So until now we have an alphabet, right? But until now, there's no vowels. As I mentioned, it's all consonants, which is working for everyone else. I mean, what that means is like, if you're going to write the word bull, someone reading that has no way of knowing if it says bull, ball, bell, or bill, right? They just kind of use like context clues to figure that out, which is working for everyone else just fine. Not working for the ancient Greeks. The ancient Greeks need vowels, and they need them for a very specific reason. They would like to record their highly coveted epic poems. These were like a big deal. I didn't realize these were such a big deal. The Iliad and the Odyssey. The whole reason the Greeks developed an alphabet was to write these stories down. So these are epic poems that were traditionally told orally. They were really like sung. They were more sung. And they're credited to Homer, who was an ancient Greek bard, but it's likely Homer didn't actually write them. They're more of like a collective cultural work sort of formed through just like generations of storytelling. He kind of just gets the credit for them. But the thing about these is that they're told in this poetic style called dactylic hexameter. And in this style, the vowels are really important. The vowel sounds are what give it its rhythm when it's spoken aloud. So for the Greeks, there was no way to record this without vowels, because when someone read it aloud, it wouldn't sound right? They're singing, it has this rhythm to it. So in order to record these, the Greeks create their own alphabet, and they include, for the first time ever, vowels. So, who of note was using the Greek alphabet? Another great lover of books, no pun intended, Alexander the Great. Alexander the Great was the king of Macedonia, which was like a region of ancient Greece. And he's really responsible for unifying Greece into like one empire. Before that, it was like just a bunch of city-states, and also expanding. I mean, he took over Persia, he took over Egypt. This guy, he undefeated, never lost a battle. I mean, he's studied in like military schools to this day. just this really prolific conqueror, and very similar to Ashurbanipal in a lot of ways. Prolific conqueror, ruled over the largest empire in the world, also very literate, very into reading and writing, also viewed knowledge as power and collected knowledge as a way to empower himself. He supposedly rode around attempting to conquer the world with a copy of the Iliad, fancied himself a bit of a 4th century BC Achilles. Now, Alexander the Great died when he was only 32 years old. He did not actually build the Library of Alexandria, but he did establish the city of Alexandria in newly conquered Egypt, and his successors built a great library there, the Library of Alexandria. Same concept as Ashurbanipal, collecting all this knowledge, this artificial memory that we can kind of tap into to get this knowledge. So the Greek alphabet then evolved into the Etruscan alphabet, which was adopted by the Romans. They tweaked it a little bit, and they spread the Roman alphabet or the Latin alphabet all over the place because the Romans were just absolutely everywhere. And the Roman alphabet is our alphabet. So we really have the Greeks to thank for vowels because of their love of the Iliad and the Odyssey. Around this time, in these ancient times, I want to point out there are a lot of really big, I guess what you could call like thought leaders, these philosophical and religious leaders that came out with these really big ideas that have like absolutely changed everything about politics and religion ever since. The ironic thing about these guys, Buddha, Confucius, Socrates, Jesus, a few examples, none of these guys ever wrote anything down. They did not write. Socrates very intentionally did not write anything down. He was worried that it would be more likely to be misinterpreted if you put it in writing, which I don't really get. That seems the opposite to me. We only know about his teachings because his student Plato wrote them down. And even when he wrote them down, he wrote them in the form of dialogues with Socrates, as if you're having a conversation with Socrates, because that was like his style. Jesus never wrote anything down. His disciples wrote everything down later. So even though these guys never wrote anything down, because the technology existed at the time, other people were able to record their ideas, and that really shaped, philosophy, politics, religion worldwide after that. I mentioned that we don't know a whole lot about ancient Chinese writing. We know that it goes back to these oracle bone scripts, and that the modern day Chinese writing honestly has not changed that much. A little less than half of these symbols are still in modern Chinese writing. And modern Chinese writing is still not fully phonetic. Like it's still, some of their symbols are still based on more like objects. So they're really like keeping it OG with their writing and have not evolved it very much. But a lot of really important technologies have come out of China that I want to touch on. The Chinese invented the compass. These are 4 that like really changed the world: gunpowder, paper, and printing. And so you might notice that 2 of these have to do with writing. So writing was clearly a very big deal in China. We also know that the writing in China influenced Japan. Japan used Chinese characters as well as their own script. And out of Japan, we have the first ever novel, which is called The Tale of Genji. And the really, really fascinating thing about this novel is that it was written by a woman. Very rare for all of history. We don't actually know her name, which says a lot. We call her Murasaki Shikibu. Murasaki was the name of the female protagonist in her book, and Shikibu was her father's position in the Japanese imperial court. We don't know her name. It's kind of like a bit of a pen name because she was really breaking with gender norms by being a female author. And we know that she was she was a lady in waiting in the imperial court. We know that she likely secretly taught herself to read and write, and that her husband died quite young, and we think that she was able to write this novel after he died. Because in this world, women were not free to just like sit down and write a book. And so she kind of had to like sneak and write this book. And she wrote the first ever novel, which I think is really cool. So that was 1000 AD. We're into the ADs here. But let's jump forward a little bit. We're going to go to 1439 in Germany. So 1439 in Germany, we have a guy named Johannes Gutenberg. And he is eagerly awaiting a fair that is getting ready to happen at a local cathedral there in Germany. And so at this fair, what they would do is they have all these relics. So they have they claim to have the swaddling clothes of baby Jesus and the shroud of St. John the Baptist. And they have the bone of such and such a saint and all this. And during this fair, they take all these sacred relics out of the church and they parade them around. And people come from all over, these pilgrims come from all over to see these relics because they believe that if you can get sort of close enough to the relics, you'll be forgiven of all your sins. If you can get this forgiveness juice that comes off the relics, then you'll be forgiven. Gutenberg was not one of those pilgrims. He is not here for the relics. He is here for a totally different reason: money. So this fair would get super, super crowded, and it would be hard to get close enough to the relics to get the forgiveness juice. So you could buy something called a pilgrim's mirror, and it was pressed tin. It would have been a lot shinier than this originally. It was this piece of pressed tin. It had depictions of holy figures. Some of them had actual mirrors. I think there was probably a little round mirror in here at one point. You could get them without mirrors too because they're just shiny metal. And the idea is that you could hold up this pilgrim's mirror and catch the reflection coming off of the relics, and you could still get the forgiveness. And so people would buy the pilgrim's mirrors, and that's why Gutenberg was here. He had created a press that he was going to use to press pilgrim's mirrors and sell them. But then the fair gets postponed for a year, probably because of the plague. They have to postpone the whole thing. Gutenberg's super bummed. He's got his press all fired up. He's ready to go. Now he's got to wait a whole year. He decides to repurpose the press. And super long story short, he invents the Gutenberg printing press. Now, he did not invent printing. I think that's a misconception. The Chinese were already printing. They were using wood blocks. They were carving their characters into wood, and you slap ink on it, press it on the page. They were already printing. What Gutenberg did is he made the process a lot more efficient, and he made it such that you could mass produce printing very quickly. He used metal movable letters. They were much more durable. You could rearrange them. He used a wine press to press it onto the page. So he just kind of tweaked this concept that the Chinese came up with, and he created the printing press. And this was a big deal, though. This was a really big deal because before this, you have to understand, if you wanted a book, someone had to write the book by hand. If you were going to get a copy of the Bible, somebody wrote the entire Bible by hand, scribes. This was a whole job. And it was very labor intensive. And so that meant that books were very, very, very expensive, and only the most elite people owned books until the printing press. Because now they're mass producing books, and common people can have books now, which is a big deal as far as the sharing of knowledge, right? Which we know is power. One unintended side effect of the printing press happened a little less than 100 years later, also in Germany, with this guy. This is Martin Luther. He was a German monk living in Germany in the late 14, early 1500s. So a monk, he's part of the Catholic Church, which is the only church at the time. And he becomes quite dissatisfied with the Catholic Church. He sees a lot of corruption from within the church. He's not cool with it. Specifically, the selling of indulgences. So this was a certificate that you could buy from the church. You would pay the church money, and they would give you this certificate that allowed you to avoid punishment for your sins. And Gutenberg's this is so corrupt. The church is making money off of this. People wealthy enough to buy these things are just sinning freely with no consequences. This is messed up. And so he wants the world to know about. He wants people to know about this. And so he writes what's called his 95 Theses, which is this paper. He makes all these points. He's really exposing this corruption in the church, which is heresy. I mean, this is punishable by death. This is a big deal. And he prints this paper using the printing press that Gutenberg invented, and he nails it to the door of a church in Germany. And as soon as they rip it down, he nails another one up, and he just keeps nailing it to the door. And he mass produces them, and he hands them out to the people. And the church is trying to round them all up and burn them, but he can actually print them faster than the church can burn them because of the printing press. And in this way, using the printing press, he's able to get these ideas and kind of expose this corruption to the masses, and it spreads like wildfire, and it leads to the Protestant Reformation, which is this massive, like, cataclysmic event that happens in Europe, where we have the Catholic Church, and now we have the Protestant Church, and countries are kind of having to decide, like, well, do we stay with the Pope? Do we do our own thing? Do we do this Protestant thing? And it leads to a lot of competition between countries, between Catholic and Protestant countries. For example, Spain, which was very Catholic, England, which became very Protestant. It leads to this serious competition, which of course causes all this political upheaval. And that takes us to the colonization of the Americas, which was done for a lot of religious reasons. It was also done very much because of this competition, specifically between Spain and England. So the whole reason why England sent a colony to Roanoke Island, to this island, was to compete with Spain. Because of this competition with Spain, Queen Elizabeth wanted a home base, like a jumping off point in order to attack Spanish ships. That's why she wanted a colony, so that she could attack Spanish ships as they returned to Spain full of all this gold that they had stolen from the Aztec and the Inca. So the whole reason we are here is because of the competition with Spain, because of the Protestant Reformation, because of Martin Luther, because of printing press. So it's really just like shockwaves going out. But while we're on the topic of colonization, I mentioned that we don't know a whole lot about Mesoamerican writing. We know that it came about 3,000 years ago, probably started with the Olmecs, and we know that it was being used by the Maya. Don't know a whole lot about it. And the reason for that is this guy. This is Diego de Landa. He was a Spanish priest living in Yucatan in the 1500s. And when he first came over, he was like very sympathetic towards the indigenous people, towards the Maya. And, you know, they were getting sick with all these diseases that the Europeans had brought over. And he felt really bad about this. And he was actually trying to help them. He was trying to heal them. He was trying to protect them. And I think he gained their trust a little bit at first. And they saw that he was a priest. He carried a Bible around. They saw that he had this book. He always had this book with him. And they had books too. And they kind of let him in on this. They sort of like let him into their little inner circle, and they showed him their books. The Maya had all these beautiful, handwritten, illustrated, just gorgeous sacred texts. And they showed them to this guy, and he's like very impressed. You know, he's in his writing, he's very impressed by these books, and oh, they're so amazing. And then a shift happens. So what happens is a cave is discovered. And in this cave, there is evidence of human sacrifice. And there are statues of sacred Mayan idols. And Landa kind of does this 180, where now he sees this and it is so not his thing, right? So it does not work within his world and within his religion. And so he starts to see the Maya as evil, as devil worshippers, and their books are the work of the devil. And so Landa rounds up all the Mayan texts that he can find, and he burns them. He burns all of their books. And so it's really because of Landa that we don't know much about Mayan writing, because he burned almost all of it. He also started torturing the Maya mercilessly. And I mean, it got so bad, they actually pulled him back to Spain and put him on trial and like convicted him of atrocities. And then they just sent him back a few years later. He like kept torturing people. I don't get it, but it's really because of Landa that we don't know that much about Mesoamerican writing. Ironically, it's also because of Landa that we do. So this paper was discovered in the mid-1900s, written by Diego de Landa, and it's mostly in Spanish, but you can see there are a lot of Mayan characters here, and he has recorded sort of his interpretation. You can see like his little translation underneath of what those characters meant. So we've since discovering this, we've been able to use this kind of cipher to decode around 80 to 90% of existing Mayan writing, which is really cool. So it's like kind of destroyed it all, but then in a weird way also sort of revived it. Diego de Landa. But also on the topic of colonization, let's go to the American colonies in the late 1700s. Writing is a big deal in the American colonies. There are newspapers, people are sending letters left and right, there's encyclopedias, Benjamin Franklin published an almanac, there's a lot of text, there's a lot of writing, and it's a really big deal, and it leads to a sort of enlightenment that happens, all of this literacy leads to an enlightenment that happens in the American colonies where people kind of wake up by about the late 1700s and they realize, they are not free. They are oppressed. They are being oppressed by a king across an ocean, a king who, side note, was incredibly mentally unstable and cuckoo, totally cuckoo. And he is, he's levying these super harsh taxes. He's taxing stamps. He's taxing paper. He's taxing their writing. He's taxing their enlightenment. And for what? Like, they're not getting anything out of it. They have no say in how this money is being spent. And people start to realize that this is not right. And they start to use writing. They weaponize the writing as a way to get these ideas out and as a way to sort of like stir the people into action. So we have a lot of letters, we have newspapers urging people to, telling people we're being oppressed, this is not right, no taxation without representation, all that, and all stirring all of these ideas up. We have newspapers, we have letters, we have Thomas Paine's pamphlet, Common Sense, which was actually printed by Benjamin Franklin. He had a printing shop. We have the Halifax Resolves, which were signed right here in North Carolina, kind of the precursor to the Declaration of Independence. It's all paper, it's all writing. A lot of what was happening during this revolutionary period in our country is writing. And it really led to the formation of our country. And I feel pretty confident saying that this country would not exist without writing. So pretty interesting there. It continues though. We have other writings that made huge changes to the Communist Manifesto from the 1800s, written by Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels. No text in the history of the world has had a greater impact in such a short period of time. Just led to this massive worldwide political shift where we have communist leaders rising up. And that shift really led to almost all of the wars of the last century, if you think about it. The Russian Revolution, World War I, World War II, the Korean War, the Vietnam War, all of these wars tie directly back to this piece of writing. So pretty big impact there. And, to talk about writing today, like, it's impossible to even quantify how big of an impact writing has on us today. Like, in your pocket right now, you have access to potentially everything that's ever been written, right? Which is like, it's hard to even think about how big of an impact that has. And, it makes me think back to Ashurbanipal and Alexander the Great and this idea that knowledge is power, but we can't keep it all in our heads at the same time, right? So if we can write it down, this artificial memory, if we can write it down, then we can refer back to it later, and we just sort of always have that power in our pocket. So in this way, writing is power. But it's a power that has been wielded very unevenly throughout history. So it's a power that has been wielded almost entirely by men. I'll prove it to you. You may or may not have noticed, out of 16 people that I mentioned by name, at least, there were others I didn't actually say their names, only one of them was a woman. And we don't even know her name. So it's very clear to see that for pretty much all of time, writing has been a very male thing. It's been a very male thing. And really throughout a lot of time periods, it was actually dangerous for women to know how to read and write, and they were very intentionally not educated and not taught to read and write. For example, this is an actual list of reasons for admission to the Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum between 1864 and 1889. I know it's kind of small, but I'll read them out to you. A couple of these reasons. We have mental excitement, novel reading, just reading a novel, overaction of the mind, overstudy of religion, and overtaxing mental powers. Not as like suggestions, these are legit recorded reasons why women were admitted to this asylum. So at the time in the 1800s, it was a common belief that overuse of your mind, women, specifically only women, overuse of their minds could lead to hysteria, which would put you in a mental institution. They also believed that women who were too educated struggled with infertility, because of this conflict between the mind and the womb. This really wasn't that long ago. Like, it's not that long ago. Now that we know this is not true, right? We know this is complete garbage. But it was used. It shows a very real attempt by a patriarchal society to suppress the education of women. And there are some theories out there, and I'll touch on one. There's some theories out there that writing, the invention of writing, is actually what ushered in the patriarchy. That our patriarchy came with writing. So one historian who puts this theory out there is Leonard Shlain. Hannah recommended this book to me, thank you. In his book, The Alphabet versus the Goddess. So in this book, he takes it all the way back to hunter-gatherer days. Hunter-gatherer days are well before writing, right? And he's looking at, traditionally men were hunters, just because they're physically more apt to be hunters. And then sort of by default, women were the gatherers. And so he's looking at these roles, these very different roles. So hunters, it's very methodical, you're scanning, it's very strategic. And then gatherers, it's a little bit more, you might be walking in a group, chatting, you might have small children with you as you're picking up nuts and berries and whatnot. They're very different. You're kind of using different parts of your brain as a hunter than you are as a gatherer. And he relates these two to this theory of left brain and right brain thinking. And this is, there's some criticism of this theory, but it's the idea that there's kind of two different ways of thinking and that some people lean in more in one direction than the other. So left brain is more logical, analytical, quantitative, whereas right brain is more creative, intuitive, and qualitative. And so Shlain argues that hunting was much more left-brained, right? It's much more methodical, it's much more strategic, and gathering was much more right-brained. And so he thinks, men because they were hunters, they kind of naturally fell into this left brain way of thinking, and women as the gatherers kind of leaned into this more right brain way of thinking. And then he argues that with the emergence of writing is a very left brain thing. It's symbols, they follow these rules, it's very analytical, it's very concrete, it's very left brain. And so as writing emerged as this very left brain concept, the men who were already doing left brain things were sort of the ones who naturally adopted this writing, and it created sort of this shift in the way that we think towards left brain thinking. And who was doing the left brain thinking? The men. And so in Schlain's theory, this sort of led to men rising up in dominance. But if that's true, we should be able to look at the relationship between men and women before writing, and it should be different, right? It should be more equal. So let's take a look at that now. Let's go back to the Greeks. I've always been a little bit confused by the Greeks because they lived in this very patriarchal society. It's actually the society on which our society is built. So thank you, Greeks, for that, I guess. But women were nothing in ancient Greece. They couldn't vote, they couldn't own property, they could legally be beaten, like they had no protection from the law. They were essentially the property of their fathers until they were passed on as property of their husbands. And that was their whole life. But what confuses me about the Greeks is their myths. Their religion is full of powerful female characters. We have Athena, goddess of war and wisdom. We have Artemis, goddess of the hunt. We have Hera, queen of the gods. And even their mortal women in their myths, Medea, Antigone, Electra, they're very defiant and they're very powerful. So it's a little bit, there's like this disconnect. Like if women in Greece have no power, then why are their myths so full of these powerful women? It doesn't really make sense. Where do the goddesses come from if women have no power? And the answer to that is they come from a time before writing. All of these stories were told orally. Remember, like the Iliad and the Odyssey, they were told orally, spoken, before they were ever written down. So here, that kind of explains why ancient Greek myths have so many powerful women, because they did come from a time before writing, before this possible shift took place that Shlain argues about. Shlain provides a few other examples. He says, quote, "A diverse variety of pre-literate agrarian cultures, the Iroquois and the Hopi in North America, the inhabitants of Polynesia, the African Kung, and numerous others around the world had and continue to have considerable harmony between the sexes." So just a few more examples there. He's pretty wordy. He's not very concise about this word. The Cherokee come to my mind as well. The women were essentially equal to men in Cherokee culture. They could vote, they could own land. The Cherokee is organized into 7 clans, and the clans are matrilineal. So you belong to your mother's clan, not your father's clan. There was a lot more equality between men and women in Cherokee culture. Now there is a written Cherokee language, but that was not developed until the 1800s, actually as a way to like appease white society and assimilate with white society in an attempt to not be forced off their ancestral lands, which happened anyways, as you can see. But originally there was no written language, and we do see a lot more equality between men and women. And there's a lot of cultures for which that is the case. But it's hard to prove with any certainty, that theory is correct, that the writing led to this patriarchal society. There's just too many variables there. But I think we can say with certainty that writing changed absolutely everything. The ancient Mesopotamian accounts, when they first pressed the tokens into the front of that clay envelope, there's no way they could have known, what sort of impact that was going to have. And that by making that switch from a 3-dimensional physical object to a 2-dimensional symbol, they were ushering in a new era. They were ushering in a totally new technology that would really change the world in so many ways. It would lead to new countries. We have all these new countries because of it, new religions, new ideas. It would lead to literature. It would lead to education. It would lead to competition. It would lead to warfare. And it would really shape from the ground up the world that we live in today. It would create this artificial memory, this dangerous and powerful thing that we see these ancient conquerors latch onto, which is writing. So that's the history of writing. Thank you guys. If you enjoyed this and you haven't listened to the pod, this is very similar style to what I put out. I have over 145 episodes similar to this out already right now that you can listen to, and new ones come out every Sunday. So once again, you can find those anywhere that you get podcasts. If you enjoyed this, check it out. And are we going to do some questions? Do we have time for questions?
We have time for questions.
Okay, so I'll open it up. If anyone has any questions about me or the podcast or anything that I talked about, I will try to answer any questions that you may have. Yes.
Is this how you typically do your podcast? At one false move?
No. Great question. No, this was definitely a lot more improvised too. I usually, when I do it, I have at least a rough script that I'm basing it off of, and I'll go off of the script a little bit, but it's a lot of takes and redos, and so it's a little more polished, but yeah. Any other questions? Yes.
How much time does it take you to learn all this before you do that?
That's a great question. I try not to, honestly, I've tried not to keep track of it because it's too much. But, I will say, I think I'm really good at, I'll sit down and I'll start reading articles and I think I'm really good at cramming information in a short period of time and then synthesizing it into a story that makes sense. I think I'm particularly skilled at that. So I will say it takes a long time, hours and hours. I think I do it faster than most people would. I think I have a weird skill in that area. I don't know how else to use that skill, but it's working well for the podcast. So yes. Yeah, Hazel.
When you were talking about the Chinese woman who wrote kind of the first paper book.
Yeah, she wrote the first novel, the first fictional storybook. Yeah.
Were there any other women who wrote any other books?
Okay, great question. So there might have been, and you know what? The thing about that is, we didn't even know her name. There very well may have been other women writing books, but they didn't put their names on it, and it may have even been assumed that it was written by a man. So it's very possible, but we wouldn't know about it. She's the earliest that we know about. I will say though, poetry was really big in that during that time in Japan, and her daughter actually ended up being a famous poet who was actually known as a poet, as a writer. So there were a few other women doing it, but she's really notable because she wrote the first novel. She was the first person to write a book about a fictional made up story. which is really cool because if you think about it today, that's mostly what people are reading. That's like a huge form of literature. So, yes, Isaac.
Were those people that were sick, were they actually dead?
Sorry, say it one more time. Sorry, people that were sick, were they actually? Oh, the Mayan people. Yeah. So when the good question. So when the Spanish and other people from Europe came over, they brought all these germs that the people living here, they didn't have any way of like fighting against. So when they came, a lot of people got sick and a lot of people died from the sicknesses. Something actually like 90% of the indigenous people of the Americas were killed by these diseases. So very, very.
And he was asking if were they really good because Diego they were.
Oh, right.
Bad.
Yeah, so he kind of misunderstood them. Like he thought they were evil, but they weren't really evil. They were just like different than him. They just had like a different way of looking at the world, and he didn't understand. So yeah, he was pretty wrong in thinking that they were evil. They weren't really evil. Good question. You have any other questions? All right. Well, thank you guys so much. I truly appreciate you coming out on such a cold night. And I hope that you got something out of it. I hope that you enjoyed it. And thanks for being here. It was super fun.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you all so very much for listening to History Fix. I hope you found this story interesting and maybe you even learned something new. As always, source material for this episode can be found in the show notes. Be sure to follow my Instagram @HistoryFixPodcast to see some images that go along with this episode and to stay on top of new episodes as they drop. I'd also really appreciate it if you would rate and follow History Fix on whatever app you're using to listen and help me spread the word by telling a few friends about it. That'll make it much easier to get your next fix.